Welcome to Alex Gordon Audios, where the grim dark universe meets peaceful dreams. These stories are crafted for those who find peace in darkness, comfort in war tales, and relaxation in the midst of cosmic horror. Prepare to journey through the rich tapestry of Warhammer lore as you drift into the void between consciousness and slumber. Don't forget to subscribe, and may the Emperor's light guard your dreams when the darkness of the galaxy threatens to consume all. Ready your minds for the next chapter. Warmaster of Chaos Part 17. Jon Skellan snarled through fanged teeth as he smashed in the skull of yet another Nergalite bastard with his club. The weapon was a brutish and ugly thing, a piece of rusted metal he had pulled from the wreckage of the Underhive, hammered somewhat into shape, and wrapped a bunch of rusted chains and nails around. Before the battle, there had still been spots of blood belonging to the last ganger he'd killed with it on it. But it did the job, especially when wielded with his supernatural strength, and in the Underhive that was all that mattered. Lisbeth was fighting by his side, wielding her own, equally ugly-looking but efficient weapon. Despite the grim and dirt that covered her, she was just as beautiful as she'd been on the day of their wedding, which only made sense, since that had been the same day the four of them had been turned. Jon still remembered it as if it were yesterday. The events of that fateful day burned into his memory. He and Stefan Fisher had known each other all their lives, and falling in love with a pair of sisters had brought them even closer to another, to the point they had been brothers in all but blood. Jon had proposed to Lisbeth on the same day Stefan had to Lena, and their weddings had taken place on the same day, both to celebrate them all becoming family, and for the more pragmatic reason that it would make the celebrations less expensive, always a concern even in their comparatively prosperous section of the Underhive. Then, right after the priest was done leading them through their vows and everyone had stopped clapping, the doors of the church had burst open, and the vampires had swaggered in, already covered in the blood of the people they had killed outside too quickly for anyone to scream. Even now, years later, Jon still dreamt of their laughter sometimes. They had taken their time with their victims, making sure nobody could escape as they killed the guests, one by one, before bestowing a wedding gift on the two couples. Jon's first memory as a vampire was lapping the stale blood of his family from where it had pooled on the floor, all reason lost to the terrible thirst that afflicted the newly turned. As their bodies' complex changes finished, thankfully Stefan was made of sterner stuff than Jon, and he had pulled Jon away from the red liquid, pinned him against a wall, and held him there until he had regained control, stoically bearing the scratches Jon had dealt him with his claws. If not for his brother-in-law, Jon was morbidly certain he would have lost himself to the beast inside of him then and there. He had never forgotten that debt, which had been the one bright spot on that awful day. Along with the fact that Lisbeth had risen as well, the two of them still together despite everything. With their human lives lost to them, vengeance had been their drive for the next 7 years, even as they learned to cope with their new condition. The monsters responsible had turned out to be from the mid-levels of Primus, having come down to slum it and indulge their depraved appetites on people nobody would miss, so that they wouldn't earn the disapproval of the vampires tasked with maintaining Cassandron's order. They might have been able to avoid the attention of the Coven's law enforcers, but they'd been wrong to think nobody would care. One by one, Stefan, Jon, Lisbeth, and Lena had hunted them down, sharpening the skills everybody in the Underhive needed to reach adulthood in the process, along with mastering the strange gifts that came with their new status. The last of the bastards, Aina, had gotten wise to their pursuit and tried to flee to the highest levels of the Hive and beg protection from the leadership of the Volkihar Coven, but they had caught up to him and ended his miserable existence on the very threshold of the mass conveyor which would have carried him to the spire. Jon had taken a dark delight in how the wretch had begged for his miserable life, even if Stefan had stopped him from making Aina suffer like he deserved before ending him. Although, given they'd been right in front of a bunch of armed guards from up the spire, he'd to admit his brother-in-law had a point. so Jon had simply ripped Agner's heart out and shot him in the head repeatedly with a shotgun. Supposedly, there were vampires who could survive that, but Agner wasn't one of them, and then for a time they had been lost, with no idea what to do next. The four of them had spent a few months wandering the hive, feeding on vermin and gangers. Eventually, they had gone back to their hometown, which had returned from ruin during their absence, as new settlers claimed the area where their families had lived before being slaughtered. With Stefan as their family's leader, they had taken the region as their territory. Since then, they had fought off gangs and rival vampires, all while carefully feeding on the population, taking enough blood to keep the beast inside satiated, but not enough to threaten anyone's life. It was a delicate balancing act, and the four of them were all too aware that they would frack up and kill someone they didn't mean to eventually. But it hadn't happened yet, and on the whole, Jon was pretty sure they'd done more good than harm. And if he was wrong, he was certainly evening that score now, fighting to protect the Underhive's denizens from the monsters rising from its deepest and darkest depths, where even vampires feared to tread. This was their family's first time fighting the brood of Nurgle. They'd been told about them by the other vampires with whom they'd occasionally dealt, but hadn't seen one before in person, which, given how many of them had revealed themselves today, had very worrying implications. But there wasn't time to think about that right now. Getting news from the rest of the hive was difficult at the best of time, but they had still gotten word of the governor's assassination. Everyone who knew the truth of the brood had expected a forceful reaction by the Spireborn. But the Nergalites' numbers had taken them by surprise. It had actually taken several hours for them to hear about the onslaught, simply because, at first, no survivors had managed to escape the brood long enough to send a warning. Once they'd heard about what was going on, though, the four of them had immediately gotten to work. After a brief evaluation of their situation, they decided that their territory was too far from the evacuation lines and defensive points being set up higher in the hive city. The four vampires might manage to make the trip alive, but the ones relying on them for protection most definitely wouldn't, and leaving them behind wasn't an option. So they'd gathered everyone they could reach, barricaded them inside the most secure building they could find, and prepared themselves to face the horde. They hadn't needed to wait long, and had been fighting more or less non-stop ever since. More and more brood spawns emerging from the labyrinth of tunnels which made up the Underhive. At first, they had just been protecting their people, but word of a safe haven had spread across the region, and people had flocked to them for aid. Jon didn't know how many exactly. There hadn't been time to do a proper head count, but it had to be in the thousands by now. Anyone who could hold a gun and shoot above their heads and into the Nergalite horde was on the walls, and anyone who could hold something heavy to smash a skull in was standing behind them, ready to finish off any horror which slipped past their vampiric protectors. So far it had worked. It felt strange to be a hero, but Jon could get used to the feeling. Unfortunately, it didn't seem he would have the chance. "We can't hold here forever," whispered Elizabeth, her words too low to be picked up by the humans but more than loud enough for the enhanced hearing of the vampires. "Not if they just keep coming like this." Her words, however softly spoken, were true. They were getting tired, even with their inhuman endurance, and their equipment, such as it was reaching its limits. Soon they'd be reduced to fighting off the brood with their bare hands, and while they could still do plenty of damage with those, it'd inevitably mean being overwhelmed and ripped apart by the frenzied horde. "We do not run," grunted Stefan. "If this is where we die, then so be it." They could still escape, Jon knew. If they disengaged and fled, the Nergalites would go after the people inside rather than pursue them. They could run away, hide from the brood until the Coven had dealt with them. But if they did that, they would become no better than Agner and his cronies, and Jon didn't value his immortal life so much that he'd throw away his soul to preserve it. Jon was well aware that, out of the four members of their strange, deathless family, he was the one with the most tenuous grip on his humanity. Even as a human, his temper had been something he needed to keep an eye on, and becoming a vampire had only made it worse. But with the help of his family, he had been able to hold on these last 3 decades, partly out of a desire not to fail them, and partly, he must admit, out of sheer spite and the drive not to give the bastards who had done this to them that last victory. And he would not let the brood spawns win, either. For the next half hour they kept on fighting with grim determination. Scratches were beginning to accumulate on their exposed skin as their innate regeneration was slowly being overwhelmed, and Jon wasn't sure whether the blurring at the edge of his vision was due to creeping exhaustion or some kind of brood plague finding its way into his cold, undead blood. Suddenly, he heard a cracking sound from behind the horde of corrupted vampires. Lass weaponry was far too valuable to be common in the Underhive, but Jon still recognized the noise from the few times he'd heard it before. Had the Spireborn sent help? It wasn't impossible. They were coming down to purge the brood, after all, and there were certainly enough Nergalites here to warrant their attention. Then he saw what was leading the newcomers, and knew that whoever this was, they weren't Spireborn at all. A towering crimson figure led a host of armored troops which looked small in comparison, but only in comparison. In the figure's hands was a blade of purest darkness, which seemed to swallow all the light around it as it sighed through the Nergalites. Behind it walked a smaller armored silhouette, carrying what looked like a heavy machine gun, except it fired last bolts instead of bullets. A woman in a weird bodysuit with a pair of blades, who moved with more speed than any vampire Jon had ever seen, and a veritable army of red armors who were firing into the Nergalite horde with ruthless precision. The broodspawns tried to run, but they were caught between Jon's family and the unexpected reinforcements. Within minutes, the last of them had been put down, and the armored titan walked toward the refuge. Instinctively, Jon raised his cracked club before lowering it with a scowl. There was absolutely nothing he could do to the war machine if its pilot was hostile, and it would be a very stupid way to die if he wasn't. "I am Ciaphas Cain," said the red giant, his voice booming out of a vox speaker on his horned helm, which was a weird design choice, but Jon wasn't about to argue with the man about it. "I am here on behalf of the Volkihar Coven and the governor of Cassandron to assist in purging the Nergalite taint from Hive Primus. Who speaks for you?" The 4 vampires looked at one another. Then Stefan hesitantly stepped forward, cranking his neck to look up at their savior, or so Jon hoped he was. "I am Stefan Fisher, Lord Cain," Jon's brother-in-law said, and bowed deeply. "Thank you for helping us." "Think nothing of it," replied the Lord, and Jon couldn't help but think he sounded sincere. "We received your vox calls for help, and couldn't just leave you alone. The entire reason we are on Cassandron in the first place is to assist its people. After all, however, I must admit, I was surprised by the sheer number of broodspawns assailing you. There shouldn't be." Cain suddenly went silent. Someone was talking to him over the vox, but his helmet was too well insulated for even Jon's enhanced hearing to pick up more than a vague buzzing. When the voice stopped, the warlord cursed. "Well, that answers my question," he continued ruefully. "It seems we were more right to come here than we thought, Sir Fisher. There is another wave of broodspawns on its way here, and it's a big one. The defenders above us have just reported in that the Nergalites pressuring them are pulling back, and my oracles tell me this place is their target." "What?" asked Stefan, sounding as flabbergasted as Jon felt. "Why? We thought your people were only targets of opportunity, drawing the brood because of the concentration of victims your stronghold represents," explained Cain grimly. "We were right, but we missed the reason for it. There is some manner of foul sorcery at play, and the people you have been defending are to be the sacrifice that will activate it." "That's impossible," said Jon before he could stop himself. When the towering red armor turned toward him, he forced himself to continue. "Broodspawns are barely more than animals. They can't plan or coordinate like this. And they don't use sorcery either." "All things change in time," said Cain somberly, "and in my experience, thinking the slaves of decay to be mindless beasts is a dangerous assumption to make. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how or why this is happening. The brood spawns are coming, and we have to deal with them. Then he turned to his forces, giving order in a calm, controlled voice, guiding the red-clad troopers as they took positions around the stronghold. Despite their bulky armors, they moved swiftly, clearly being experienced in such tactics. Those with ranged weapons took position to lay down, covering fire, while those who carried heavy shields and melee weapons formed a wall behind their lord. For a moment, Jon simply looked on. Then he shook his head, snarled, and with a pulse of supernatural strength, leapt over the heads of the crimson-armored soldiers to land on the other side of their line, ignoring Stephan's alarmed shout. Cain wasn't alone, Jon saw. The two figures which had stood at his side during the earlier battle were both still there, and they immediately turned toward him, hands moving toward their weapons, only to stop as their lord raised a hand. "Are you sure about this?" Cain asked, looking down on Jon. "This is our home," replied the vampire. "I'm grateful for your help, but I won't let you fight alone." "Very well," said Ciaphas Cain. "I won't insult your honor by denying you this. Tell me, though, what's your name?" "Jon Skellan, Lord." Lisbeth landed next to him, soon followed by Stephan and Lena, all of them looking at Jon with fond exasperation. Cain looked at them all, his thoughts unreadable behind his faceplate, and nodded slightly. In the distance, Jon began to hear the sounds of the brood spawns approaching again, and his hands tightened around his cub. "And what of you, ladies?" "Lisbeth Skellan, Lena Fisher," they replied. "Fine names one and all," said the warlord, before turning toward the source of the growing cacophony that heralded the Nergalites' return. His armor moved with surprising grace, even as it crushed brood-spawn corpses underfoot with every step. They had fought for so long, the entire open space was littered with them. "All together then," he declared, pointing his weapon forward and igniting its black energy blade. His voice rose up, carrying across the space. "Hear me! Not one brood spawn shall get past us, for Cassandron and the Protectorate." The battle cry was picked up by every crimson-clad soldier, and to Jon's own surprise, he found the words emerge out of his own throat, along with those of his kindred and the shooters hiding behind the shelter's barricades. How easily they'd all fallen in Cain's orbit, he thought. In the brief moment before the brood spawns erupted from the tunnels and the butchery started anew. In hindsight, I really shouldn't have been surprised that everything went wrong so quickly. The cleansing of the Underhive had gone extremely well to begin with. Getting from the spire top to the lower levels had been a slog, but the Covens had made sure to maintain a decent level of transport infrastructure, likely with this exact scenario in mind. So although it had been a bit of a headache to coordinate, we had managed it relatively easily. Once down here, the USA troopers had started butchering the Nergalites with great enthusiasm, and the Cassandron PDF showed a surprising level of competence. I suspected that being used as cat's paw in the vampires' politics had kept their skills sharp. Vlad himself was fracking terrifying. I didn't know who would win if it came to a fight between him and Militia, or Hector, but I knew I would fare very poorly outside of the Liberator Armor, and would prefer not to test it inside either. The only trouble, if you didn't count the thousands of Underhivers who had already died by the time we even got there, but there was nothing we could have done to help them, had been the revelation that vampires, including the brood, were somehow undetectable by any conventional technology. Thus, while our logistic corps were planning our descent, the Borgs had worked feverishly to create an emergency patch for the USA troopers' suits of armor. The update disabled their sensor suites, which wouldn't have been able to detect the Nergalite. That was good, because I must admit, the idea of fighting an invisible enemy had filled me with terror. I had been nervous about deploying this update, since there hadn't exactly been time for proper testing, but the alternative was too dire to contemplate. Fortunately, the Borgs had once again surprised me with their competence, and there hadn't been any major issues with it so far. Equally fortunately, the standard USA training covered how to fight without the benefits of a power armor's enhanced sensory capabilities. I'd been thinking of how the daemons of chaos could mess with technology by their mere presence when I'd added that course to the curriculum, and I was trying very hard to convince myself that the vampire's disruptive effect on all surveillance technology wasn't anything like the warpspawn's own. I wished I'd been able to ask Aurelio and Cristobal for confirmation, but there hadn't been an opportunity to talk with them somewhere that wasn't likely to be bugged or otherwise spied on before I had to leave. For the Underhive, the Ansible connection was still up, but I had no idea how sharp the vampire's senses were, and asking whether our new allies were actually some rare kind of daemons in disguise wouldn't have been good diplomacy. Fortunately, a quick word with Jurgen had confirmed that the vampire's supernatural abilities weren't like those of psychers. While my aide had felt something when Akivasha had annihilated the Nergalites back at the spire, it had been distinctly different from the impression he got when his fellow witches called upon the Empyrean with their own unnatural gifts. Of course, we couldn't guarantee that the same was true of the broodspawns. In fact, it was all but certain that they had their own warlocks among them, so I'd ordered Jurgen to avoid using his considerable psychic talents unless absolutely necessary. Just in case. Besides, he was more than deadly enough within his suit of armor, his multi-barreled lascannon cutting down swathes of Nergalites with nearly the same ease it had the infected of Skytophore. I was beginning to see a pattern here, and I didn't like it. Unlike the infected, brood were capable of speech and basic planning, and my paranoia refused to let me think, for a moment, that it was a coincidence they had returned to the spotlight right in time for my visit to this planet. I had a sneaky feeling that Nurgle was escalating in response to me foiling his puppet scheme with Zarea on Adumbria, which meant there had to be more going on than a mere uprising by a rapidly spreading plague of monsters. I'd gone to battle, piloting my own custom suit of armor, which would have been overkill for this type of enemy if I'd believed such a thing existed. Like its predecessors, the third iteration of the Liberator Armor had an extensive sensor suite, but I'd been forced to turn off nearly every one of them and rely instead on my own eyes, looking through the lenses of the suit's helm. Mercifully, the Borgs who'd built the thing had made sure those were clear, something I'd have considered part of how over-engineered the whole thing was, but which I was now very grateful for. Even with its senses hampered by the enemy's weird abilities, the armor was still more than worth the effort of bringing it down to the Underhive. Between its toughness and the sorcerous wards against corruption that had been woven into its design, the fangs and claws of the brood could do little more than scratching the paint, and I had been able to lead from the front without worry, cutting down entire swathes of the Nurgle corrupted mutants with Liberation's edge. Then one of the USA's Vox officers had told me they were picking up a faint signal coming from some distance off our planned path. A few adjustments of the device by one of the Borgs who had accompanied us, and we'd been able to decipher the distress signal. Despite how badly garbled it had been by the poor quality of the transmitter and interference from trying to get any kind of signal which didn't use the techno-sorcery of the Ansibles down here, I had thought rescuing the civilians would be a nice way to avoid the darkest depths of the Underhive. Ken the Liberator had a reputation for valuing the lives of civilians, and there was even a case to be made that since the brood spawns were attacking them, coming to their aid was tactically as well as morally sound, the latter of which admittedly had little place on the galaxy's battlefields. Of course, I couldn't divert the entire Protectorate complement from the initial battle plan on a whim. Strategic stupidity aside, it would make it look like I was scared, which I was, but I couldn't have everyone else realize it. However, I could take command of a small detachment and bravely lead them to rescue the endangered civvies, while leaving the bulk of the fighting to my subordinates. I had left Hector leading the rest of the USA troopers, along with General Malone, who, unlike the World Eater, had to stay in a command vehicle and properly coordinate things instead of rushing ahead of the soldiers in a whirlwind of messy death. It had seemed like the perfect way to avoid having to fight in potentially unstable terrain while wearing several tons of power armor. Out of all the ways I could die, being crushed by a hive quake was one I'd thought I'd left behind when the Shola had taken me. At first, my plan had appeared to work like a charm, despite the itching of my palms which told me the other shoe was just waiting to drop. Sure, I'd needed to fight once we'd reached our destination, but the Nergalites had presented little danger to me inside my suit of armor, and with Jurgen and Militia at my side, to say nothing of the bunch of bloodthirsty, cornate psychopaths. But I repeat myself, following me. But no sooner had we crushed the vermin between ourselves and the locals that Harold had piped in over the Anselor network, cheerfully informing me that he and the other Rockles had detected some kind of infernal sorcery at play here, and that the Heavers were probably the target of some grand sacrifice which would rupture reality and allow the putrid legions of Nurgle to enter the Materium. From the way he'd phrased things, I could tell he had somehow deluded himself into thinking I'd known about it from the start, or at least strongly suspected it. I hadn't said anything to dissuade him of that belief, though I hadn't confirmed it either. In my worryingly growing experience, managing the expectations of insane chaos cultists, letting them come to their own conclusions about myself, was much safer than outright lying to their faces, if only because most of them had spent years lying to their superiors and hiding the fact they'd sold their souls to the ruinous powers. In any case, it was stuck here now, with only my aid, my bloodwood, a company of USA troopers and 4 vampires, who looked more like under-hive gangers than the dark aristocracy I'd encountered in the spires. At least unlike Akivasha, none of them were likely to be able to tear me open with their mind, else they probably wouldn't be down here in the first place. What I hadn't told Stefan and the other vampires was that, according to Harold, the Nergalites had deliberately herded survivors to them so that they could kill them all at once. The stronghold was more or less directly above where the Magi had located the lair of the brood in Hive Primus, though there were several hundred meters worth of metal in the way, which apparently would have helped with whatever it was the mad mutants intended to do. Being trapped in the underhive with a daemonic incursion of Nurgle would be very bad for my chances of survival, even inside the Liberator's armor. So I had no other choice but to stand my ground, lead the defense, and make damn sure I lived to inconvenience the Plague God. Another day, the soldiers went into position, showing that all that time and resources spent building elaborate training scenarios hadn't been in vain, which I felt ambiguous about. But right now it meant they were better prepared to save my life if I needed it. I gave another short, rote-inspiring speech, once again, using the training I'd received at the Schola for a cause that would have horrified my old instructors. Absently, I wondered how they were doing, what with having apparently trained a traitor to the throne. But that train of thought didn't lead anywhere good, so I swiftly abandoned it. Then it was time to fight once more. There was a brutal simplicity to the fight. In truth, the brood spawns were trying to get past us, to slaughter the civilians cowering inside the boarded-up building so that they could feed the despair and horror of their final moments to the warp, and we were fighting to stop them. Inside the Liberator Armor, I'd no choice but to fight in the vanguard, but it continued to do its work admirably well, although it would need a new coat of paint once this mess was over. For the next 4 hours, the USA troops and our new vampire allies held the line against the brood. All the while, I kept receiving reports from the rest of the purging forces, informing me that, thanks to the distraction we were providing, things were going very well everywhere else. They were in awe of my strategic genius, because of course they were. At least I could vent my frustration on the brood spawns instead of screaming incoherently over the Vox. Eventually, the drudgery of the battle dragged me into a weird, semi-meditative state, where I kept slaughtering the brood spawns by the score, regular small injections of panacea and stims, keeping me from feeling fatigue as I directed the movement of the Liberator Armor. This wasn't the mindless rage Hictor had described so many followers of Khorne fell into, thank the throne, but rather something I suspected had happened to countless human soldiers in our species' long and bloody history. And then, suddenly, it was over. No more Nergalites emerged from the passages to throw themselves at our line. Despite our overwhelming advantage in equipment, we had still taken losses. USA troopers had been dragged down by clutches of broodspawns, who had used their supernatural strength to rip open their armor and do horrible things to the fleshy humans inside. None of the fallen were in a state to get an open casket funeral, even if their bodies hadn't been going to be burned on the spot to prevent contagion as a matter of procedure. Out of the 100 troopers I brought with me, nearly a quarter were dead, and that number again were wounded, though the Panea would take care of that promptly. Now the fight was over. The 4 vampires were all alive, though definitely the worse for wear, with the one who'd nearly given me a heart attack when he'd jumped over the soldiers to land next to me. Having lost an eye and half of his face, Jurgen and Militia were fine, the former's armor having absorbed what few blows the broodspawns had managed to land. And if Militia had even taken a hit or felt any exhaustion whatsoever, I couldn't see it. I raised Liberation's edge up, careful not to accidentally cut into the ceiling and cause debris to fall on me, which wouldn't have done my image any good. A cheer rose up from the survivors, swiftly picked up by the local defenders on the wall. Then the cleanup started, with the troopers piling up corpses for the pyres as the medics ran checks on their squads. I told them to go check on the civvies once they were done. We'd brought more than enough panacea with us, and it was a good opportunity to foster some goodwill. You never knew when someone would know something useful. They would feel more inclined to share once you'd done them a good turn. After all, as the tainted gore of thousands of brood spawns cooled on the floor, my armor's internal systems chimed in to inform me that I was being hailed over the Vox. And it was a powerful signal to work so deep in the hive. I checked the caller's ID and found that it was marked with Vlad Volkihar's personal sigil, or rather that of the man who spoke for him when using devices which didn't register the existence of vampires. It was hard to believe that the Covens could run a planet without such basic conveniences as being able to use a Vox, but I guessed it ensured they would always need human servants. I blink-clicked the link open and was greeted by someone speaking within a tone I'd have expected from a butler at a fancy banquet rather than someone in the middle of a purging operation. Predictably, I didn't like what he had to say. Vlad Volkihar laughed in exultation as he cut through the hordes of the enemy, his power blade acquired from off-world through a series of intermediaries at an obscene cost, but well worth the price, slicing plagued flesh and rotten bone with equal ease. Behind him came the elite of Cassandron PDF, carrying shock mauls and riot shields, guarding the ranks of soldiers equipped with standard-issue lasguns, who followed in their wake and fired above their heads. Even as he laughed, though, part of his focus was spent keeping himself from succumbing to the beast that dwelled within the heart of every vampire. It would give him strength, true, but it would also rob him of his intellect, and he needed it to wield his weapons rather than rip the Nergalites to shreds with his bare hands, let alone lead the armed forces under his command. Besides, losing control to the monster within was among the greatest faux pas of the Coven's ruling elite, as it implied that the vampire's will was weak, and with what had happened to Manfred, Vlad couldn't afford to look weak to the rest of the Coven if he wanted to have any hope of keeping his rank of regent once this was all over. Manfred. Vlad still couldn't believe his progeny would fall so low, even though the evidence his servants had discovered in the spire after the attack was undeniable. He had always known Manfred was ambitious. It was part of the reason why he had turned him in the first place. Ambition was a valued quality among Cassandron's human nobility, a virtue to cultivate to prevent them from becoming too reliant on their immortal masters and give up on exercising power for themselves. Vlad had thought that, as a Volkihar, Manfred would channel that passion and ambition to pull the Coven to ever greater heights. But instead, Manfred had fallen prey to the same trap so many vampires did. He had become too self-centered, thinking only of increasing what was his by taking from others, rather than by contributing to the expansion of the whole. Still, Vlad had held on to hope that his progeny would grow out of it in time. Now, however, that would never happen. Manfred had become a parasite instead of a symbiote, a net drain on the Coven, and while that was failure enough, it paled into insignificance compared to his alliance with the Brood. Even trying to kill Vlad would have been more acceptable than this. With all vampires being immortal, there were limited opportunities for advancement. And while killing one superior to take their place was frowned upon for obvious reasons, it was still more or less regarded as a fact of life, so long as the would-be usurper was subtle about it. More importantly, didn't endanger the entire Coven in doing so, something which Manfred's unholy alliance with the Brood most definitely had done. There could be no forgiveness for what Manfred's actions. He would die for this, and Vlad would be the one to deliver the death blow. Finding him would be difficult. Manfred had successfully hidden his treachery for who knew how long, but there were very few places beyond the reach of the Volkihar Coven. Before Vlad could avenge this slight on his honor, however, he had more pressing duties to attend to. The brood spawn had known they were coming, of course. So after their brazen attack, even their corrupted minds couldn't fail to realize that retaliation would come, and they had chosen instead to strike first. Within hours of the governor's assassination, reports had begun to reach Vlad, relayed from the vampires who, having failed to earn a better place for themselves in the ceaseless games of power and influence of the Coven, dwelled closer to the bottom of Hive Primus than its top. Hundreds of brood spawns had emerged from their hiding places and immediately gone on a frenzy of feeding and infection. Unlike the true gift of the untainted Covens, the brood could spread their curse with incredible speed, and even the strongest-willed infected humans could only resist the madness that had devoured the Ruthven Coven for a few moments before succumbing to it. Turning someone making progeny from mortality's clay was a lengthy and delicate process, with the Maker staying by their chosen side and helping them through the changes, all while regularly feeding them both their own blood and that of other humans. Oh, it was possible to make it quick, to simply pour blood into the mouth of someone as they lay dying and let the ancient power of the precious crimson fluid work on its own. But that ran the chance of the progeny rising as a feral beast, fit only to be quickly dispatched. Some lowly vampires might still resort to it, but not the aristocracy which ruled the Covens. The dark gifts of Nurgle, however, completely changed these rules. As more and more underhivers were assimilated by the brood, hundreds quickly became thousands. If they weren't stopped, these thousands would become tens of thousands, which would become millions, and then Hive Primus would fall, just like Hive Septimus had fallen thousands of years ago. Vlad remembered it well. The sight of the corrupted Hive city was burned into his memory, deeply enough that not even the fog of passing centuries could cause it to fade. He had been human back then, an officer of the Cassandron PDF, part of the forces gathered for the purge of Septimus. It had been his actions during that time which had marked him as worthy of the gift, bestowed by none other than Lady Akivasha herself, one of the Coven's most revered members. It had been a nightmare where the atrocities of the brood had damaged the barrier between the materium and the warp, to the point it had been on the verge of breaking. If not for the ancients' defeat of the thrice damned, all of Cassandron would have been transformed into a playground for daemons, with the brood of Nurgle left to rule the ashes. Things would not degenerate to such extremes this time, though. Although this particular outbreak was of a size not seen since the Purge, the Covens were still well used to dealing with such situations, and the Nergalites had never been able to recover from the losses they had suffered during the Purge of Septimus, when their corrupted elders had been slaughtered to the last. Even without Cain's help, they would have eventually cut out this infection. That wasn't to say Vlad didn't appreciate the Protectorate's assistance. Well trained as the Cassandron PDF might be, they were still restricted by the quality of equipment the planet could produce that was fit for militarum service, and indeed, the system had raised numerous regiments for the Imperial Guard, tied from units that had been carefully kept ignorant of the Coven's existence. But it was clear that the USA's own war gear was on a different level. Vlad would have to make inquiries about acquiring such gear for the PDF at some point. Not that their equipment was the only reason for the Protectorate's troopers' efficiency. Far from it. After the strategy meeting in the Spire, Vlad had asked one of Cain's aides, as politely as he could, whether the man had making a jest, when he'd mentioned the USA trained its members inside a space hulk. While the question hadn't been taken as an insult, thankfully, the uniformed woman had barked a brief laugh and assured him that no, the Liberator hadn't been joking. Now that the Imperium had abandoned Tordun, Cassandron must look to its own defense, and the coalition which had gathered under the Liberator looked to be their best bet. Making alliances with the followers of Chaos was unprecedented. Over the millennia, preserving the secrecy of the Coven's existence from the Imperium had been their absolute priority, and the disciples of the Dark Gods weren't renowned for their subtlety, at least in the long term. And the leaders of the Covens, by definition, always looked to the long term. But Lady Akivasha had ordered it be so, and the Volkihar Coven had followed the lead of its awakened ancient. Given that it was Cain's blood which had awakened her, and that even without the Broodspawn uprising, the food the Protectorate brought was the miracle the Covens had been hoping for since the collapse of the trade routes. Even as they made preparations for famine, it only made sense. There was also the fact that the Protectorate had a fleet in orbit, which the Cassandron CNDF couldn't possibly stand up against, but nobody had been so gauche as to bring that up in polite conversation. Not that there was any real danger of Cain opening fire on the planet. For all his martial prowess and dedication to chaos, it was clear that the Liberator held a much non-imperial view on civilian casualties. He'd gone so far as to split off the main thrust of the purge to go defend a bunch of survivors, with nothing but a company of troopers with him. The fact he'd given command of the rest to Sir Hector, one of the two Astartes who had accompanied the Protectorate envoys to the planet, without hesitation, said something about the trust Cain held for his subordinates. Vlad wasn't sure what exactly, but he'd find out in time. "My lord," said Vlad's aide, the latest in a long line of mortals who'd held the title after approaching him during a lull in the fighting. "We've been contacted by Sir Hector. He told us the Protectorate forces have reached the Nergalite lair, but there's a problem. He's asking us to join them as soon as possible." "So, we lost the race then," mused the Volkihar regent. The PDF and Fartatrup forces had split up on their way to the depths to cleanse more ground and avoid being too disadvantaged by the terrain. "Very well. Let us see what the issue is." Moments later, Vlad was standing at Hector's side at the entrance of a large cavern which had formed amidst the rusted metal and crumbling ferrocrete of the Underhive. The way in was blocked by a green shimmering barrier, the sight of which made the vampire nauseous despite not having eaten anything solid in millennia. Without a word, Hector picked up a rock and hurled it at the obstacle. The stone stopped mid-air as it hit the barrier, before crumbling apart as sickly roots burst from inside it. "Sorcery," spat the Astartes. "I haven't checked what happens when someone tries to go through, but I can guess, and the scouts I've sent to try to find another way report the same thing in every passage. We can't go any further until it's brought down." "Great," sighed Vlad, hiding his worry. This was something new. He hadn't seen anything like that in Septimus. Maybe the ancients had when they'd gone deep into the Thrice-Dam's palace, but that wasn't exactly reassuring either. "Do you know how to do that?" "No," replied the former World Eater, "but I know who can. We need to call the Warmaster. Jurgen, his aide, should be able to break it, and if he cannot, ask Vlad." "Then we're going to need to call the Magi from the fleet and have them join us here," shrugged Hector. "But that will take a lot of time, so you're right, I'll call Cain right away." If nothing else, he reflected as his own aide tried to raise Cain on the Vox, the Liberator would appreciate the opportunity to join them for the final push into the lair of the brood. After the call of the Regent's aide informed us of the situation, we left the refugee stronghold and its local defenders behind. The 4 vampires actually offered to join us, and after a moment's consideration I agreed, but made a show of worrying for the civilians, so that only one of them, Jon Skellan, the one who'd first volunteered to keep fighting, would come with us. For all their admittedly impressive strength, the 4 vampires could do little that 100 USA troopers couldn't when it came to fighting the brood. But having a local with me could always be useful. On balance, I decided that the boost to my reputation was worth the sacrifice of 3 additional bodies I could put between me and the enemy. We made our way deeper into the Underhive, Skellan soon proving I'd been right to bring him along by guiding us through the labyrinth of collapsed corridors and unstable passages. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that my own tunnel rat's sense of direction was as sharp as ever. Despite the years that had passed since I'd been on a proper Hive world, and I was able to anticipate many of the turns our vampire guide led us through. The deeper we went though, the more nervous I got. Not just because we were approaching the lair of a bunch of crazy Nurgle corrupted mutants who apparently had a witch powerful enough to erect a sorcerous barrier capable of stopping the advance of an entire army, although that certainly was part of it. More immediately worrying, however, was the fact that the lower levels of the Underhive were in an even worse state than the ones we'd traversed so far. Eventually, I was forced to come to terms with the inevitable. I couldn't take the Liberator Armor any further, not without risking causing a collapse, which would see us all buried under enough rusted metal and dirt that even Jurgen would strain to dig himself out with his psychic powers. Never mind the rest of us. The armor's servos were strong, yes, but I was all too aware of just how many megatons of potential rubble hung above our heads. Also, the tunnels were becoming smaller and smaller, and while I could have just dug my way down, the previous point made that an unacceptably risky course of action. Of course, I couldn't help thinking that leaving the Borg's masterwork unattended in the Underhive was a poor idea. Even with most of the locals having fled or been eaten, I was cynically certain we'd be lucky to find a single bolt of it left by the time we made our way back. There was nothing for it though, and truth be told, if some enterprising scavvies were resourceful enough to break the massive piece of war gear apart and carry it away, they deserved to have it. Besides, I had a few more stored aboard the Fist of the Liberator, precisely due to what had happened the previous 2 times I'd gone into battle in one. We took Liberation's Edge with us, of course. Jurgen picked up the weapon's deactivated form and started carrying it without me even needing to ask, holding it with all the care of an ecclesiarch entrusted with a relic of the God Emperor. Unlike the rest of the armor, it was irreplaceable. Since the Borg still hadn't cracked the scavenged Drukhari technology it was made of, it could technically be wielded by someone in a standard suit of power armor, but only in the same way an Ogryn could technically use a tree trunk as a club. It would hurt whatever it smashed. Yes, but you would have Horus's own time trying to hit anything in particular. That left me in my own suit of custom-made, human-sized power armor. While it had a few extra bells and whistles I hadn't asked for, but hadn't refused either. It was basically the same as every trooper's when it came to how much damage it could take before breaking. I was armed with my trusty chainsword, which had gone through so many repairs over the years due to my regular practice with the USA. I doubted there was much left of the original weapon and that damned bolt pistol I'd taken from Caesarea Giorba in what might as well have been another life. I told myself there was no reason to panic. I had survived for years in an Underhive before, and I didn't have the advantage of such advanced gear or a bunch of hardened killers dedicated to protecting my life. Yes, the Nergalites' use of sorcery was concerning, but the infected had done the same on Adumbria, and I'd managed to survive there too. Still, all my attempts at rationalization couldn't stop the tingling of my palms, which I'd learned long ago was one of the ways my subconscious tried to warn me of imminent peril. Although really, in this particular case, I had already figured it out for myself. It took us around an hour to link up with the rest of the forces. I spent every minute waiting for an ambush that never came, but made sure no trace of it could be heard in my voice as I greeted Regent Volkihar, General Malone and Hector, who stood around a hololithic projector showing a patchwork map of the nearby tunnels. Lord Liberator, Malone, identifiable only thanks to the rank markings on his own armor, as he was keeping his helmet on, like every other trooper, answered me. This was his first time being deployed on the front line of a military operation since the uprising, and part of me had worried his cornet nature would rise to the fore at the opportunity. But it seemed that particular worry had been for nothing. The general appeared to still be as professional as ever. "Follow me," he continued. "We set up camp out of sight of it, because, well, you'll see." He led me past the impromptu camp, around a bend in the path, and gestured at the obstacle which had stopped their advance dead in its tracks. "This is it." The sorcerer's barrier filled the tunnel completely, and the map showed that, just like Hector had told me over the Voxnet, it formed a sphere surrounding a spot exactly under the location of Skellan's stronghold. It shone with a sickly green light, and as I looked at it, leering faces began to appear, staring back at me with enough malice to extinguish the very stars. I tore my eyes away, blinked, and the barrier was back to looking like a strangely colored energy field. I really wanted to believe that had only been my imagination, but I knew better. Since leaving the Shoreler, I had learned more about the warp than I'd ever wanted to. The fact that I'd been affected like this, despite my armor's wards, was far from reassuring. "Yes, I see why you didn't want to wait for us next to it," I said out loud. "It is most unpleasant. Jurgen, could you—" Before I could finish telling my aide to do something about it, how exactly, I had no clue, but in my experience, asking Jurgen to get something done and letting him figure out how was the best way to get results. The barrier faded away, completely vanishing in a few seconds with a sound like a relieved sigh. "Jurgen?" they asked weakly. "Maybe, just maybe." "That wasn't me, sir," my aide replied, sounding as concerned as I felt as he mercilessly crushed the last of my hopes that his powers had somehow grown by leaps and bounds since the last time I'd seen him use them. "Didn't have time to do anything, as a matter of fact." "That," I said in the silence that followed this announcement, broken only by the slow dripping of unidentified liquids and the groaning of the underhive, "was far too easy." "You are correct," replied Vlad, frowning. "A trap, then." Well, let it never be said that the Volkihar Regent wasn't capable of basic pattern recognition, and a more competent strategist than such imperial luminaries as Chenkov and Karamazov. That was something to be thankful for, I supposed, trying very hard to see a silver lining and not to think about how the mutant noble helping keep a millennia-long conspiracy hidden from the eyes of the Imperium was more competent than a Lord Inquisitor, an Imperial commander. "That is almost certainly the case, yes," I agreed, "and given that the path opened only after we arrived, it must be aimed at you," finished the vampire noble, who didn't sound all too pleased that the ancient enemy of his people apparently saw me as a greater priority than him. They made two of them. I briefly considered turning back and returning to the spire, leaving this mess to Vlad and the rest. If the enemy wanted me here, then logic dictated that I shouldn't oblige them. It only made tactical sense. Unfortunately, while running away with my tail between my legs would get me out of danger in the short term, it would damage my image in the eyes of the USA. And there was also the fact that, if I left, I'd have to take Jurgen and Militia with me, and either of them could prove to be the decisive factor in the incoming struggle. If the task force failed because I'd removed them from it, then I wouldn't be any safer after all. I would just have lost my chance to stop whatever the brood was up to in time. Well, if our friends have gone through the trouble of setting up such an obvious invitation, it would be impolite to refuse, I said, as nonchalantly as I could fake. Sir, Maloney cut in. With all due respect, I don't think you should lead the way in there. There's no way of knowing what foul sorceries the Nergalites have set up. I made a show of looking dejected, rather than jumping in joy like I actually wanted to. I'd been fully resigned to leading the charge into unknown peril, but for once, the universe had thrown me an opportunity to let someone else do it without losing face. You're right, General. The honor of leading the advance will go to someone else, I said, with as much reluctance as I could fake. Hector, if you would. The World Eater bent over, then stood up and threw a piece of rubble through the space where the barrier had been. The rock flew with a speed any urchin would have envied and smashed against the opposite wall, leaving a dent. "Can't hurt to be careful," said Hector in his unnaturally deep voice. Someone might have been feeling clever and kept the barrier's effect in place, even if we couldn't see it anymore. I nodded judiciously, as if I had thought of it as well. Hector went ahead of the rest of the task force. While his power armor wasn't much tougher than that of the troopers, his gene-forged biology was on another level entirely. Even with the panacea granting miraculous regenerative capabilities, there were limits. Hector could survive injuries that would kill a normal human outright, long enough for his armor to increase the dosage of the substance continually coursing through his system. "Blood of the gods, it stinks in here," he called out after a few moments. "But I don't see any traps or ambush, and I can hear something coming from deeper in, chanting. Oh, brilliant. A Nergalite stronghold, whose sorcerous protections went down the moment I got near with its inhabitants chanting. The trap couldn't have been more obvious, but walking away and letting the broodspawns finish whatever they were doing unbothered would only be worse in the long run. "All USA units activate void protocols and move in," I ordered, before turning to Vlad Volkiar. "Your soldiers cannot follow us in there. I'm afraid their equipment won't protect them from that kind of environment." "It might be so, but I am immune to such poisons. And before you ask," he added with a smile that showed teeth too pointy to be reassuring. "Yes, that extends to the vile contagions of the brood. We have tested it over the centuries. As long as I don't actually drink their blood, I will be safe, and I assure you I've no intention of sullying my tongue like that." There was little I could say to that, and having another body to put between me and danger was always nice, especially since Vlad had his own reasons for being on the forefront of the advance. So I nodded somberly, and we all went in. Soon it became clear that the brood of Nurgle had claimed a long-abandoned, hollowed-out machine as their lair. What purpose it had served in the early days of Cassandron's colonization, I could only guess, given its age and the further defilements the brood spawns had inflicted upon it. I doubted even the Borgs could have identified it. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of the Lord of Decay's influence. Crude renditions of the three pustuled rune of Nurgle had been carved into the rusted metal by brood-spawn claws. Swarms of blood flies and other infested vermin had to be cleansed before our advance, with flamethrowers and rotting corpses hung from meat hooks, twitching in a morbid parody of life as their liquefied insides were devoured by warp-born pathogens. I didn't need to be a psyker to feel the rage radiating from Jurgen at the spectacle. After the cleansing of Skyttafall, the hatred of all things related to Nurgle had become deeply ingrained within the USA. But even the Cornity's wrathful disgust paled compared to my aide's far more personal enmity toward the servants of the dark god of decay. "Stay calm, Jurgen," I urged him. "Losing control here will only serve our foe." He nodded stiffly, but didn't respond aloud, which I had to guess was good enough. Just like what had happened in Skyttafall, the Vox stopped working as we went deeper into the Nergalites' lair. Without the Liberator Armor or Malone's command tank, we were cut off from the Ansible network. I had made sure to inform Harold beforehand to keep him or Christabel from panicking at my silence and do something stupid like flood the planet with summoned daemons looking for me. We were reduced to shouting and hand gestures, but human armies had managed just fine with those for millennia. Once again, the USA's training aboard Emily's Gift was proving its usefulness, as even after years of work by the Borgs, there remained entire sections of the Space Hulk where conventional methods of ranged communication were disabled by the alien nature of the walls. Soon, I too could hear the noises Hector was talking about. It was like chanting from many voices, but only if the throat of every singer had been cut and sewn back together by someone with only the most basic understanding of surgery beforehand. We came out into a large open space, which was nearly filled with thousands of broodspawns. the source of the dreadful singing we'd heard. Surprisingly, despite the fact there was no way for an army of USA troopers to advance stealthily, none of them were looking in our direction. They were all turned toward the other side of the cavern, where a crude altar had been constructed by piling up pieces of broken rockrit and rusted metal. Another Nergalite stood atop the altar. All at once, the brood spawns each turned to face one of their kind and simultaneously plunged their claws into its chest before tearing out their hearts. Black, rotten blood flowed onto the ground from the ripped organs and the holes they had left behind, completely covering it in a repugnant tide. For a moment, we simply stared in shock. Then the coin dropped, and I understood what had just happened with sickening certainty. They're offering themselves up as sacrifices. I roared. My little detour to the stronghold of Skellan and his folks had prevented the brood from slaughtering the civilians and harvesting their deaths. So instead, they were using their own members. To what end exactly? I hadn't the faintest idea, but I knew it couldn't be good for me or Cassandron. Kill the priest. Now. I shouted, joining action to word and bringing up my bolt pistol. Without hesitation, the troopers opened fire, and despite the distance, a large portion of the shots were on target. But the space around the witch was distorted, and not a single last bolt hit. I cursed silently. There was nothing for it. We'd have to get this done close and personal despite the obvious danger of such a course of action. Charge, I shouted, joining deed to word, all too aware of the hundreds of eyes watching me. To my relief, Melissa overtook me almost immediately, as did Hector and Vlad, their inhuman bodies granting them speed far beyond even what was possible inside a suit of Slockenberg-made power armor, and behind them, bless their insane souls, every single trooper followed, bellowing Comote war cries, and my name as they did so. Exactly 7 seconds after we'd started our charge, however, the gory mess under our feet flickered with a familiar greenish light, and I saw Jurgen flinch in the corner of my eye. Before I could call out a warning, a hand burst out of the Ish, a humanoid figure with one grotesquely large eye, a single broken horn, and the skin of a corpse that had stayed underwater for months, pulled itself out of the pool of gore. Though of course, that was merely how my mortal senses interpreted the manifestation of the lesser daemon of Nurgle. It held a sword in its hand that looked so rusted it would fall apart at a stiff breeze. But as it brought it up to strike at me with surprising swiftness and I parried it, reflexively with my chainsword, it held fast against the whirring adamantine teeth. That didn't stop me from chopping the daemon's head off with my return strike, but even as I did so, I noticed many more of its kind rising from the mire. Plaguebearers. I knew of them from that time. A hollow supposed to depict the events of Adumbra had become a gateway to the warp, due to some moron using actual footage of the infected. In the aftermath of that particular clusterfrag, I had asked Christabel and Jafar for information on that breed of Neverborn, reasoning that since I'd pissed off the Lord of Decay, I might as well know my enemy. It had predictably led to several nights of difficult sleep, especially since I couldn't use alcohol to drown the terror like I'd done earlier in my inglorious career as a traitor to the Golden Throne. While Plaguebearers were among the lowest servants of Nurgle, they were supposedly each the soul of a mortal who had died to Nurgle's rot, a truly horrific warp-born pestilence which tainted the soul as well as the flesh. Of course, since absolutely nothing remained of the mortal within the Plaguebearer, I suspected that the stories were complete. Grok's shit. I didn't doubt that the victims of Nurgle's rot were the source of the Plaguebearers, but in the same way a caterpillar infected with the eggs of a parasitic insect was technically the source of the resulting creatures. The deluded followers of Nurgle might believe that their dark god granted them immortality by helping them ascend to a lesser form of daemonhood. But in truth, they were only food for his legions. I had shared that theory with Jafar, who had stared at me with a look of mixed horror and awe before rushing out to try to confirm it. Since summoning daemons was still forbidden on Slockenberg, the opportunities to run proper, scientific. I had no idea what that word meant, But it was important to the Borgs and Magi alike. Experiments were rare, but he'd later come back to tell me that, at the very least, nothing in their existing knowledge outright countered it. Regardless of their true nature, the Plaguebearers were a dangerous foe. Their warp-forged blades could cut through power armor in blatant mockery of the laws of physics, and the numerous infections of the weapons could strain even the panacea's healing properties. Soldiers in crimson fell and didn't rise, though few of them died outright. The remainder were left to twitch on the ground in agony, their bodies turned into a battleground between the Nergalite sicknesses and the panacea their gear had automatically injected them with. "Form up on the Liberator," shouted Marlone. As a member of the Liberation Council, the general's duties left him little time to train. But while he couldn't go through the same insane training program as the USA's common troopers, power armor was a great equalizer, and he could still direct the men and women around him with his voice when the Vox didn't work. "The daemons are converging on him." I'd hoped it was my paranoia talking, but of course it wasn't. I was the one who had thwarted the plague god's schemes on Idumbria. After all, the one who had found the panacea aboard Emily's gift, and the one who had shared it with the Imperium. Still, facing the undeniable evidence that one of the dark gods had it out for me wasn't a pleasant feeling. My own armor had been enhanced with sorceress wards crafted by Christabel and Jaffa themselves, in one of the rare instances of the two of them working directly together. In theory, these protections could turn around the Plaguebearer's blades as if they were mundane weapons, but I would much rather avoid testing it, so cowering behind 100 armored troopers sounded very appealing at the moment. However, my reputation, the only thing which kept the heretics I was surrounded by in check, demanded that I respond to Marlone's orders. I cut down another Plaguebearer with my chainsword and kicked its lower half away before pointing the weapon, dripping with infernal echo, toward the altar. "Keep moving," I roared. "Take down the source of the summoning." We pushed through the mass of daemons, but for every one that fell, 2 more rose up to take its place. Even inside my unpunctured armor, I could smell the foul stench of the creatures, its supernatural nature, ignoring the fact I was breathing recycled air. With a blink click, I activated the panacea injector, reasoning there was no such thing as being too cautious in this situation. Fresh strength filled my tiring limbs, and my growing nausea faded away. I kept on fighting, allies at my side, but though we were still making progress, it was agonizingly slow, a grinding battle of attrition which favored our enemy. Militia could have crossed the remaining distance thanks to her superior agility, but her duties as my bloodward demanded she stay near me. It would do her no good if she killed the broodspawn witch, only for me to be slain in the meantime. As for Jurgen, he was already using his powers liberally, striking at the infernal host with bolts of warp energy and telekinetic force that obliterated handfuls of the monsters at a time. But I knew that, in surroundings such as these, this was straining him, and the closer we got to the witch, the worse it would get, as the god of decay's influence got stronger and stronger. Hector, however, was unbound by any such restrictions, and so were Vlad Volkihar and Jon Skellan. The World Eater bellowed oaths to the blood god as he cut down swathes of Plaguebearers with his great chain axe, and the 2 vampires followed one step behind him. The regent fought with a deadly elegance that seemed to be a mix of Melitia's fluidity and Hector's raw power, while Skellan fought with the same kind of ruggedness I'd witnessed in the most vicious and tenacious underhive gangers in my youth. Together they carved a bloody path through the Plaguebearers until Hector climbed atop the altar where the still chanting witch stood, and with a single blow bisected it vertically. For a single heartbeat, I dared to hope that this was over. Then Jurgen started shouting again. Something is, whatever warning my aide wanted to give, he didn't have time to finish speaking it. The dead witch, its 2 halves still standing up by some grotesque miracle, detonated with enough strength to send Hector, Vlad and Jon flying, and force every trooper in the room to the ground. Thankfully, the Plaguebearers were also affected, or we would surely have suffered grievous casualties. By the time I returned to my feet, unsurprised to find Malika already standing guard over me. The daemons of Nurgle were gone, vanished, as if they had never been here. A quick look told me that Hector was still alive, albeit embedded in a wall on the other side of the room, which he was trying to pull himself free of with only limited success. I was about to order some troopers to go assist him when I saw something which chilled me to my core. Smoke was rising from where the Nergalite witch had stood, except it wasn't smoke, I realized, but a cloud of buzzing flies. Before my eyes, the warp-spawned insects coalesced to form a humanoid figure over 5 meters high. The resolution, for lack of a better word, was extremely poor. It was like looking at a low-quality, glitchy hololithic. Yet, the vision was still terrifying enough. As I could catch glimpses of bony spikes piercing through skin, a pair of curved horns, and eyes that burned with the same fell light as the barrier which had protected this place. It looked like no daemon of Nurgle which I was aware of. The figure's appearance must have been familiar to Vlad, however, for I heard the Volki-Har regent gasp from where he had landed. "No," I heard Vlad say, shock and horror clear in his voice. "It can't be." "But it is, little Vlad." The sorcerer's projection purred, speaking through the swarm's buzzing. "Surely you recognize me. It has been many years, and you were still untainted by Cassandron's curse. But it was a most memorable night, was it not?" "Talk to me, Regent," I snapped in my best commanding voice, hoping to drag the vampire out of his shock. "Who and what is that?" "It is the thrice damned," replied Vlad, still sounding out of sorts. Then he snarled, using anger to overcome his surprise, or at least making a good show of it. "You are dead, abomination. Dead and gone these last 4,000 years. I was," easily admitted the spectre, "but Lord Nurgle gave me a second chance, once I had done my penance in his bountiful garden." "If you truly believe that, then you are even more of a fool than you look," I cut in. Drawing the creature's attention to myself was the last thing I wanted to do, but I was confident it wasn't really present in the room with us, although that might have been the case had we not stopped the broodspawn's ritual in time. Nurgle is merely using you as a tool to further his ends, nothing more," I continued, playing into the part of the Lord of Decay's enemy which I had unwillingly stumbled into years ago, all too aware of the dozens of USA troopers staring at their liberator in awe. "And hello to you too, Ciaphas," the repugnant apparition chuckled, and I shivered when I heard it speak my name. "Your blasphemy is expected. Guragath sends his regards, and his fervent wish that everything you have built and everything you love will crumble before your eyes, before they too rot and fall out of their sockets." I see that in addition to his numerous character flaws, he is a sore loser as well, I replied, forcing my tone to remain light. "I can't say I'm surprised about it, or that the two of you are acquainted. You certainly are as ugly as he was before I cut him apart and sent him to the warp." "Acquainted? We are kin, he and I, in the eyes of our Lord," the thrice damned boasted. "I met him in the garden, when he delivered your Salinishi friend's message. It was then that the realization hit me like a power hammer. In hindsight, I really should have got it, the moment Vlad identified the creature as the thrice damned. This wasn't some sorcerer playing with forces he didn't understand, nor a minor daemon manipulating the brood to its advantage. Throne. It wasn't even a greater daemon like the one responsible for the infection of Adumbria. This was a daemon prince, a being which had once been mortal, or as mortal as the vampires were, before being elevated to daemonhood by his patron deity, like Emily, whom the thrice damned apparently knew. Although I couldn't say I was surprised she'd been making waves in the Emiterium, she was just that kind of woman. This was bad. Really, really bad. I wasn't clear exactly how the infernal hierarchy worked between daemon princes and greater daemons, but I knew that Amithi, at least, was powerful in the court of the Dark Prince, unless she'd managed to deceive both the handmaidens and Tsinshian Magi regarding her power. But Since she'd pulled a fracking space hulk out of the warp, I was inclined to believe she'd been truthful. If the thrice damned had ascended to the same level of power, but aligned with Nurgle, then this didn't bode well for Cassandron, and more pressingly, me, since I was the poor fracker who had spread the panacea as far as I could. Then I remembered my words to Gurugath, spoken in the throes of a frenzied rage which had somehow let me defeat the greater daemon, responsible for the infection of Adumbria, and my stomach dropped even further. In my brief fit of insanity, I had threatened Nurgle, the dark god of decay, himself. The fact that I hadn't immediately keeled over and managed to stay alive since then was a miracle I had tried very hard not to dwell on over the years. But now I was face to face with a daemon prince of Nurgle. But no, this wasn't a daemon prince in front of me, I told myself, merely a projection, like what Emily sometimes did to speak with me, without manifesting on Slarkenberg in all her dark glory. If I could deal with Emily, then I could deal with this. Is that so? I must say, I'm curious, I said, half playing for time, so that everyone who'd been thrown off their feet could get back up, half fishing for information. If the story we were told are true, you were a vampire when you turned to the Lord of Decay. What I don't understand is why. You were already immortal and powerful. Was it simply not enough? Again, the monster gave a chuckle. Do you know, little heretic, you are the first one to actually ask me this. Back during my first rise, the ancients merely came in weapons bared, hardly surprising given you were trying to turn their people into monsters and kill them all, I pointed out. In my experience, you don't ask questions to a plague, you burn it out. True, but as you well know, it doesn't always work. As for your question, the answer is simple. Vampires are abominations. The thrice Dan's eyes flared with mad zeal as he spoke, and the fact he was hovering atop an altar gave the whole scene the appearance of a crazed prophet, addressing a crowd of unbelievers. I saw how our very undying existence is an affront to the natural order, and wept for us all. But Lord Nurgle forgave me, despite my blasphemous nature. He welcomed me and all of the Ruthven Coven into his embrace. The Covens tried to erase me from history, to strip me of my very name, but they failed to realize that they only made me stronger by cutting off the last remaining ties to my former, pathetic self. The projection raised his arms in a morbid parody of an ecclesiarch, giving a benediction. I am Hashatik, and all Cassandron shall be remade as I have been remade, in great Nurgle's embrace. Not if we have anything to say about it, and as you can see, I gestured to the charnel house surrounding us. We've already thwarted your schemes here. Here, yes, but elsewhere? Oh, I didn't like the implications of that. Despite the helmet and armor I wore, he must have felt it, for he chuckled again. Come find me if you dare, Ciaphas, he taunted. It will end where it all began, and when it is over, my lord will have his due, and you will pay for your childish defiance of the inevitable. Inevitable. That word again. I was getting really tired of it. What was it with every fracking spawn of Nurgle that crossed my path using it to threaten me? Was it due to their fundamental belief that all things ended, which made sense enough to me, and it was thus better to embrace entropy, rot and decay, and spend a marginally longer existence in horrid agony, so that when death finally came, it was a release which most definitely didn't? Or was it something else, something related to the monster that haunted my nightmares from time to time and stared back at me with my own eyes? It didn't matter. There was only one acceptable response, and for once, it was one I and the Liberator agreed on. Nothing is inevitable, I snarled. Jurgen, disperse this spectre. We've wasted enough time here. Right you are, sir, replied my faithful aide as he stepped forward. Eshikagik's gaze turned toward him, filled with open contempt. But before he could say anything, Jurgen slapped his hands together in front of him with a thunderclap. There was a pulse of energy in the smell of ozone, and the flies which had made up the thrice dam's projection fell to the ground, dead. even as the unholy pressure which had been weighing us all down since entering this place slowly began to dissipate. It would take a lot more than Jurgen's little trick to cleanse the corruption here. I knew. I was under no illusion that, for all his power, the main reason Jurgen had succeeded in ending the Daemon Prince's transmission was that he'd already said everything he wanted to say. It's time for us to leave, I told everyone. We must re-establish contact with the rest of our forces and figure out what this all means. Because of course it couldn't be as simple as a traitor in the Volkihar ranks taking advantage of the situation and manipulating the brood spawns in a bid for power before being predictably double-crossed by the Nergalites and almost unleashing an apocalypse on the very Hive city he presumably wanted to rule over. If I somehow ended up facing this Manfred character before this was over, I was going to give him a piece of my mind and have Melixer give him as many lethal injuries as it took to put a permanent end to his stupidity. Victory was theirs, though the revelation of the thrice-damned's return had cast a pall over it. As they left the brood's lair, consigning it to fire, Vlad Volkihar mused on what had happened this day, and what it would mean both for Cassandron in general, and the Coven's alliance with the Cainite Protectorate in particular. In all his centuries of life, Vlad had never seen an Eldar fight, though he had heard their kind had raided the Sangha system for generations. He had heard that even their lowliest warriors were supposedly the equal of a score of human soldiers. And while he had disregarded the tales as obvious exaggeration at the time, having seen the Lady Malictia fight, he was forced to reconsider. Cain's Bloodwood was a dancing terror, cutting down the foe in droves as she dodged or turned aside every attack that came her way, her cruel laughter echoing down the tunnels of the Underhive as she fought with an elegance that wouldn't have looked out of place in the ballrooms of the highest spires. Should it come a battle between the two of them, Vlad was confident he could win, but only if he had time to call upon the fullness of his gifts to push himself to her level. Hictor had been equally impressive, but then Vlad had expected nothing less from a space marine, even one who had turned against the Emperor. The Coven's contacts in the Imperium kept them informed of the various potential threats to their existence, and Vlad's office contained a sizable dossier on the capabilities and tactics of the Asters. Chapters operating in the Damocles Gulf, just in case they one day needed to fight them. Hector was perhaps a tad more aggressive in his way of fighting, but he still fell within the bounds of Vlad's expectations. Cain's aide, the Psyker Jurgen, was more difficult to analyze. Vlad wasn't unfamiliar with Psykers, of course. Cassandron paid its tithe to the black ships like any other Imperial world, though the Regent had a feeling things were going to change in the future, and just like any other Imperial world, there were those psychically gifted who sought to avoid being shipped off-world. Inevitably, such individuals came to the attention of the Covens, who had a strict policy of dealing with them swiftly as part of their general goal of keeping the Imperium from investigating the planet. During his rise to the rank of Regent, Vlad had fought such wild Psykers several times, their meager powers proving no match for the strength of the blood. But it was clear that Jurgen was something else entirely. If the way he dealt with the thrice-damned sorceress projection was any indicator, and then of course there was Cain himself. By all rights, the Liberator should have been the least of his party's fighters, by virtue of being, as far as Vlad's eyes could tell, an unaugmented human. But Cain had fought like a man possessed, showing physical abilities far beyond those Vlad had seen from the USA troopers, who used more or less the same armor as their leader. Every blow of his chainsword had been perfectly aimed, and every shot of his bolt pistol had felled at least one of the Nergalite daemons. The Volkihar Regent suspected that whatever changes had made Cain's blood so delectable to his maker were also responsible for his incredible martial prowess. Surely, the Liberator was no mere man, unless his power armor was somehow far more advanced than that of his soldiers, which didn't fit with Vlad's observations. Even the Underhive vampire Skellan had proven interesting. One of the few things Vlad regretted about his ascension to Regent was that his duties kept him in the spires of Hive Primus, surrounded by the nobility of the Coven, and while all of them had proven their worth before being turned, there was a part of him that missed the simplicity of battle and the simple camaraderie that could be found between soldiers. Skellan was no soldier, but he was a fighter to be sure, a gem in the rough that Vlad believed could serve the Volkihar Coven much better than by remaining in the Underhive as a vigilante. Among the covens, influence had to be backed with personal power. It was a tradition harkening back to the first days of their kind, according to the lessons Lady Akavasha had taught him. Supposedly, it was linked to the mysterious origins of their race, of which even Vlad knew little. But the Regent suspected it had more to do with legitimizing the rule of the ancients, who wielded absolute power over their descendants. They linked up with the Cassandron PDFs, who had established a cordon around the brutespawn lair, and began their ascent back up the Hive. Within an hour of forced march, the USA troopers handling the rapid advance remarkably well, even taking their power armor into account. Vox contact was re-established with the rest of the planet. The good news was that the rest of the planet still stood. The bad news was, nobody could say whether that would stay the case for long. The thrice damned has returned. The thought kept repeating in Manfred's mind as he was once again forced to flee for his life to escape the flames of the burning Nergalite stronghold. Once he was out of immediate danger, he moved through underground passages that, unless he was already lost, should lead him to the wasteland beyond the borders of Hive Primus. He had a safe house there kept stocked with frozen blood, not nearly as satisfying as drinking it straight from the vein, but it would sustain him, and a small flyer that could take him anywhere he chose on the planet. Even boosting his speed with his powers, the journey there would take him several hours at best, giving him plenty of time to ponder what he had witnessed. After making his way down the Hive to avenge himself on the broodspawns who had dared manipulate him, Manfred had found his way blocked by sorcery. His efforts to break through or find a way around the barrier had been in vain, but they'd kept him occupied long enough to hear the approach of the PDF and Protectorate forces. Since the Cainite heretics had clearly a more advanced knowledge of sorcery than anyone on Cassandron, he'd kept watching, and sure enough, they had brought the barrier down and went inside to confront the source of the brood in Hive Primus. During the fight that ensued, Manfred had managed to stay hidden, drawing on the talent he had learned from a Jackath centuries ago, as payment for erasing evidence of the other vampires' involvement in some scheme or another. He didn't remember what exactly. Not that it mattered, since the Jackath had gotten killed a few decades later in an unrelated power struggle within his coven. Being able to completely erase his presence, to the point that not even a vampire's enhanced senses could detect him, had taken a lot of practice, but the benefits were well worth the effort. Especially since it seemed that his ability had even worked on the daemons which the broodspawns had summoned with their own sacrifice. Thanks to this talent, he had then been able to listen in on the exchange between his maker, Cain, and the arcane projection. Part of him wanted to dismiss the spectre's outrageous claims, but another part of him knew, deep within his blackened heart, that the creature had spoken no lie when it had declared itself to be the thrice damned return. It was clear now that Manfred had been manipulated, instead of being the manipulator as he'd thought. The fact it had been done by none other than the legendary renegade regent of the Ruthven Coven was poor consolation. His goal had always been to rule Cassandron, and he couldn't do that if the Nergalites consumed it under the leadership of Hashakagik, and joining them straight up was out of the question. He had too much self-respect for that. The thought struck him that he could just leave. From the Vox chatter he'd been able to intercept before getting too far from the Allied forces. It seemed that the situation in Hive Primus was repeating itself across the rest of the planet, with Nergalite outbreaks rising up from the underhives. With every hive city in chaos, Manfred was confident he could quietly vanish, either in the underhive of Primus or by securing passage to another hive, where his maker's influence wouldn't reach. Now that Cassandron seemed on the verge of reconnecting with the rest of the galaxy, he might even be able to escape off-world and start over, creating an entire new lineage of vampires who regarded him as their progenitor. That firebrand Jacob had supposedly done so on some distant world called Necromunda, though given the circumstances of the outcast's departure, there was little information about him going around even for a spy master such as Manfred. But no, Even as the idea came to him, Manfred knew he wouldn't do it. It would be too much like giving up, like admitting defeat. Manfred was many things, but a quitter wasn't one of them. He would rule Cassandron, nothing else was acceptable, which meant that he had to find the opportunity that surely must exist within that chaos, and there was only one place he could think of where he was guaranteed to find it, where the brood of Nurgle had begun, and where, according to the myths of the covens, its remains yet lingered. He would go to Hive Primus.